Hey, DawgNation, I'm Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. I'm glad to have you with us. It's going to be a good show today. A lot on the transformation that's going to attempt to take place for the Georgia offense here this season. I think there's a real hopeful idea to kind of have in your mind of just how possible that really is. Maybe not to the extreme examples we've seen in recent years, but at least the kind of changes that Georgia needs to take place. We'll talk about that. Also talk a little bit about the eventual return of football on today's show. I think there's some important things that need to be said about that. And there is a Georgia player who we probably don't talk enough about, who I think you need to highlight at least a little bit today. So we'll give some attention to a player that maybe hasn't always gotten enough attention here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. If you can't tell, it's going to be a busy one. We're glad to have you as part of it. DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia, begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. Dial 678-ESOG now for a solution to your foundation and waterproofing problems.
Presented by DawgNation.com, this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
All right, I'm going to do something off the top of the show today, and I hope that you find this as interesting as I did kind of getting this stuff together. I think one of the things that we would say is the big storyline ahead of Georgia. Now, this is putting aside coronavirus and everything else. The big story for Georgia as it gets ready to start the upcoming season is how much offensive change is really possible. How much offensive change will we see occur for UGA? Because when you have as good a defense as Georgia seemingly on paper has, and remains to be seen if it's the very best in the country, very best of all time, very best whatever, all the accolades that are seemingly out there, one way or another, we know that the kind of the basement for Georgia, the overall bottom baseline level of performance for UGA is probably pretty good defensively. So therefore, you just need a little more offense, and all of a sudden you're talking about a far different outcome in terms of end-of-season result, potentially playing college playoff, national championship, everything else. But we know that offense last season for Georgia was really hard to come by. And by the end of the year, Georgia fans were just so fed up and so frustrated. You guys, watch in our comment section every day, or you see the stuff that's going on there in social media. There was just a lot of frustration for UGA fans about just how much unless it was third down against Florida, pretty much for the entirety of the season, that Georgia offense just had a hard time kind of kicking into gear. And it kind of came to a head, culminated with the SEC championship game, where not only was, Georgia fans forced to watch LSU just marching up and down the field, really embodying the kind of offense that I think Georgia fans wish their team had, but it was also another game in which Georgia had some chances early, just could not quite put it together, and it was another situation of the high-powered offense moving on to the college football playoff, Georgia kind of settling for that Sugar Bowl for the second year in a row, and when the game was over against LSU in the SEC championship, Kirby Smart was asked about, hey, what's going on offensively? Do you think you need to kind of be more like what you see from an LSU? Do you need to be more like that? And at the time, I thought that Smart gave a pretty interesting answer, although I don't agree with everything that he said, but it does set us up for our conversation today. Let me let you hear Kirby Smart going back to December.
You have an offense that's built around the players you have. So you take the players you have and you use their strengths. Well, with the players we have certain strengths. We usually have good pass protection. We have a good, offensive line. We got good backs, but our ability to run the ball has not been consistent this year. And people can say, well, Coach Smart wants to play man ball. Coach Smart wants to win. And we threw the ball 42 times. Now, you can say it was because we were behind, but we threw the ball early in the game. And we had some drops. We had some misses. And it's not a matter of what is your offensive philosophy. It is what is the best way to win the game.
So obviously we would agree with that at the end, that winning the game is what's important. The part that, from even at the time, that I kind of disagree with Smart on, though, is the notion of, hey, you have to use your offense around the talent that you have. You have to look at the players you have, what they do well, and build your offense around that. I would suggest at the college football level, one of the things you really need to do is look at an offensive scheme that makes the players that you have better, finds a way to utilize their talents even more, finds a way to capitalize on what they do. And it seemed like in the James Coley era of 2019, that wasn't always the case for Georgia. By now, you know that. That's water under the bridge. I think the question becomes, what do you do next? Where do you go from here? And here's where I think that there is absolutely reason for hope for Georgia fans that this offense is better this upcoming season. Now, I promise you, I'm not going to beat you over the head with preseason magazine talk. I did talk about Phil Steele magazine a good bit yesterday. I want to talk about it a little bit more here. And it's not that I don't even think that Phil Steele is necessarily the greatest analyst out there. I'm not even sure I think the Phil Steele magazine is the best of the preseason magazines, but it is a data point. It is kind of a snapshot of where common opinion is about the season before it begins. And for a Georgia team looking for a huge offensive transition here in 2020, a transformation really to something much better, I think it's important to note just how much LSU kind of found itself in that same spot a year ago. And if what happened for LSU a year ago could occur in 2019, then something similar for Georgia could potentially happen here in 2020. Let me give you a couple of numbers that back this up. So what Phil Steele does in his magazine every single year is look at the top units in college football. Best quarterbacks, best running backs, best offensive line, all the different position groups. And what's amazing to me is how similar Georgia's 2020 groups look in comparison to LSU's in 2019. Now, the reason why we make this comparison is obvious. LSU essentially became about the best offense any of us have ever seen a year ago, but you would have been hard-pressed to find any evidence of that prior to the start of the 2019 season. Here's how Phil Steele projected LSU's quarterbacks going into the 2019 season. Obviously, Joe Burrow ends up winning the Heisman Trophy. He had them 21st to start the year. He's got Georgia at 16. Georgia's actually, according to Phil Steele, in a better position to start this year of 2020 than LSU was a year ago with Joe Burrow. How about running backs? He had LSU last year at 25th. Now, Clyde Edwards-Helaire went on to rush for 1,400 yards last season. He's got Georgia 14th to start this season. The LSU wide receivers, he did have a higher opinion of. He had them 10th to start last year. Obviously, they go on to produce the Biletnikoff Award winner, Jamar Chase, last season. Georgia, he doesn't think quite as highly of those receivers to start this year. He's got them 28. But offensive lines, relatively similar. He had LSU 11th to start last season. He's got Georgia 17th right now. The point here with all of this is none of those projections for Georgia to start this year would make you believe that UGA is on its way to a great offensive campaign. But when you look at LSU last season, it was very much the same kind of stuff, and yet Joe Burrow went on to throw 60 touchdown passes. LSU seemingly was scoring about 50 points a game and coasted its way to a national championship on the heels of an offense that could not be stopped. Now, all of that leads to the question of what does that mean for Georgia this upcoming year? And honestly, I don't know that the LSU statistical performance from a season ago is necessarily a good benchmark for Georgia. That may be hard to achieve. But it's fair to point out that what LSU did last season was in itself, pretty almost impossible to put together based on the previous track record of the program. I don't just mean offensive statistics. I mean wins and losses overall. Isn't it true that LSU had, 3 SEC losses in 5 of the previous 6 seasons leading into winning the national championship a year ago? That the offensive transformation that took place was actually a program transformation that put the entire program on a different plane than it otherwise had been. All of this, I realize, puts a degree of pressure on Todd Monken. And when Kirby Smart has been asked about this and asked about the transformation, he's done everything he can to kind of sidestep that the best he possibly could. Let me give you an example of this going back to February.
I don't know the answer to that. I think the roles on our 2020 staff still aren't complete with our extra assistant coach spot open. I think that will develop and play out as we go along. I'm certainly excited. I know that the kids are excited for an opportunity, and we'll have to see where that goes. I can't honestly say that right now. I think everybody wants to hear some grand speech of opening this up and doing that. That's not necessarily what you need. Is to be productive offensively, score points, and do the explosive plays, which we've talked about consistently.
So obviously that clip before the hiring of Scott Cochran, it's really the last part of it that matters. Kirby saying, hey, everybody wants a grand proclamation of what we're going to be on offense, and I'm simply not going to say those words. I'm paraphrasing, but that's kind of what Kirby Smart says there. However, I would argue that the real grand statement from Smart is not anything that needs to be said. It's the action that he took. Todd Monken's a real offensive coordinator with some real credentials. It stands to reason that he could have gone and coached a lot of different places. This is a guy that's been a play caller in the NFL, has been a head coach at the major college level before. This is a guy that's got some real credentials and seemingly would have had his choice of a number of jobs. The fact that he came to Georgia leads you to believe that he's coming to Georgia for a reason. The fact that Kirby would make a hire so outside the box of what he has seemingly had in the past is also a statement in and of itself. I'm not saying that Georgia's going to have a quarterback throw 60 touchdown passes or going to score 50 points a game the way that LSU did a year ago, but I am saying that we saw an unbelievable transformation take place in the SEC a year ago. The Tigers are the team that I'm talking about, not just in terms of how much better they got statistically speaking offensively, but how much more team success they enjoyed because of that. If it happened a year ago for LSU, it's at least possible for Georgia this year. The presence of Todd Monken, I think, is the biggest story of all heading into the start of the year. And as I said yesterday, absence of spring practice, weird start to this upcoming season, coronavirus this, coronavirus that. That's an excuse. And I don't think there's any room for excuses for Georgia right. It's made the big hire. It's brought in the transfer quarterbacks. It seemingly got the talent in place. And this needs to be the year. This very well could be the year we see a big offensive transformation occur for the Bulldogs. My name is Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by our friends at Engineered Solutions of Georgia. Good to have you with us. Video, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, radio at noon on Athens Sports Radio 960 The Rev, and as a podcast, wherever you find them, including the world-famous DawgNation.com. Really glad to have you with us for all of it. It'll be Connor Riley here coming up in just a few minutes. Before that, though, let me remind you that we're brought to you today by our friends at ESOG, Engineered Solutions of Georgia. There's a reason that word solution is in the name. It's a solutions-based company. So when you're dealing with a foundation issue, a waterproofing issue, when you see some wet spots showing up in your basement, your crawl space, garage, whatever else, those could be signs of a problem that needs to be fixed, and probably is a sign of a problem that needs to be fixed. That's what Engineered Solutions of Georgia does. They solve problems. They're also proud partners of UGA, which makes them really fun to do business with. You can find them by simply dialing a very easy number to remember. Dial 678-ESOG now. That's 678-ESOG now. That'll get you in touch with Engineered Solutions of Georgia. They can just handle the work that you need. Foundation issues, not the kind of thing you want to put off. ESOG's got 2 full-time engineers on staff, so trust them. Put them to work for you. Dial 678-ESOG now. That's 678-ESOG now. That'll get you in touch with Engineered Solutions of Georgia. And as I said before, they are proud partners of the University of Georgia there as well. So there's an unavoidable topic that we have to spend some time on from time to time when it pops up, because we're all obviously curious to find out, is college football returning? I believe that it probably is. How different is it going to look when it does return this fall? I believe it'll look somewhat different. And there's a lot of things in the news that give us a clue, either to the good or the bad, about how all of this is going to shape up and play out. We're probably only a few days away from hearing some rather big announcements from the SEC and the rest of college football on that front. For a lot of people, it seemed to be a setback this week when yesterday, and I think this for the most part happened while we were on the show live yesterday, a huge number of Miami Marlins players tested positive for coronavirus. So much so that their game had to be canceled last night. It's had a ripple effect in the schedule in Major League Baseball. I'm not sure when the Marlins will play again. This is all kind of a weird situation for Major League Baseball. However, most of the sport did move on last night for the Braves. That wasn't necessarily great news, as they lost to the Tampa Bay Rays. But the point is baseball seemingly trying to navigate that issue. They have taxi squads available. The Marlins can replace their positive tested players with some guys off their minor league ranks. This was part of the plan that Major League Baseball put into place. But for some people, this becomes an opportunity to really ask some big questions about, is it even possible for college football to take place? Let me give you an example of this. Dan Wolken, USA Today. Now, listen, for the most part, I feel about the same way about Dan Wolken that many of you do, but this is still a snapshot of a fairly common opinion amongst people who kind of occupy that status of columnists for the big national media types. So here's Wolken, USA Today, and you have to read this in a very serious voice. He said, what happened to the Marlins is a flashing neon sign speeding toward a college football season while the country registers 60,000 new COVID-19 cases a day, likely to end as listen to this part, likely to end as a failed experiment that ruins the credibility of everyone involved, not to mention putting athletes, staff members at some risk and contributing to the spread of a public health crisis. Now, it's the statement in the middle there that I want to spend a minute talking. So according to National Writer here, can I see that on the screen one more time? According to National Writer here, he says that the attempt to even play college football is going to be a failed experiment that ruins the credibility of everyone involved. That word credibility, I think, is really interesting. Wolken would say, people like him seemingly would say, hey, by even trying to do this, by even trying to do your job and build a sport, get it back on the field again, you're putting your credibility at risk. And my simple question to that would be, my simple, response to all that would be, doesn't that door swing both ways? That if we're going to say that the people in charge of running sports league are potentially risking their credibility by trying to do their job, then shouldn't there be some loss of credibility at stake for the people who say it can't be done if it eventually is done? And this is not a hypothetical conversation, but let's go back to a sporting event that's already taken place. Think about the NFL draft in April. Now, the NFL draft in April, I think, came across as one of the most successful events in modern NFL history, and it came across at a time in which fans desperately needed sport. But much the same way you see melodramatic columnists talking about how college football does need to take place this fall, you also had melodramatic media people saying the NFL draft didn't need to take place going back to April. Let me give you an example from about as high up the food chain as you can go. One of the most famous NFL reporters of all is Adam Schefter. This is Adam Schefter on ESPN prior to the NFL draft saying the event did not need to take place. Here is Schefter.
We all want to see the days where we have that distraction of football, but OTAs, that's not happening. Yeah. The offseason program, that's not happening. The draft is happening only through the sheer force and determination and lack of foresight from Phil Franklin. I mean, they are determined to put this on while there is carnage in the streets.
Carnage in the streets, he says. Yet the NFL draft drew a record 55 million viewers, and it raised $6.6 million for charity. Now, there are some people would say Schefter is just a brave truth teller here, and he's speaking up against the powerful people who are trying to make sports happen. Some people treat him as a hero. Yet, if you, in the face of that criticism, go on to have your event, run your event, it satisfies 55 million people, raises millions of dollars for charity, then couldn't you say that the real hero were the people that moved on and participated in sports in the face of the criticism? My point here is that if we're going to put credibility at stake for the people trying to have a college football season, trying to manage a college football season, then the credibility of the naysayers needs to be at stake as well. And by the way, we have said over and over again that when it comes to coronavirus, this is a very serious issue, and there is a lot about this we still don't yet know. We continue to see it impacting, in some cases, very negative ways, the health of people all across this country, all across this world. This is not about the virus. This is about what our response to the virus is going to be. And there are smart people involved in college football who say, we think we have a plan to have our season even in the face of something as serious with the coronavirus has turned out to be. We saw some naysayers say the NFL draft shouldn't take place, and yet it was a smashing success, both in terms of how it was responded to by America, the money it raised from a charitable standpoint. If the college football season goes off as well, if it turns out to be as successful as what the NFL draft turned out to be, then the people who said the season shouldn't take place, I think their credibility should take a hit from that there as well. It's DawgNation Daily. It's presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. Good to have you with us. As I told our video audience before we're done today, I'm going to spend some time talking about a Georgia player that we probably don't spend enough time talking about, but a guy that's gotten some attention here nationally over the course of the last couple of days. We'll do all that coming up, but for now, let's talk to our buddy Connor Riley.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
Good to talk to Connor Riley again. Been a while since we've done this. I was on vacation last week, so it's nice to be settling back in, talking to Connor Riley again here today. Connor, we appreciate your time and looking forward to really been enjoying reading the things you've been writing there at DawgNation.com, some of which we'll get into here in just a couple of moments. It's great to have you with us.
Yep, as always, glad to be back on the show.
So let me spend a couple of times on the subject I was just on, because I would think that your opinion on this might be slightly different than mine. If the word credibility is going to come up in terms of even trying to have a season, then if the season goes well, shouldn't the credibility of the people who say we shouldn't have a season, shouldn't that be at stake here in this a little bit also?
I guess theoretically, but as a media member, which you technically are, do you not worry that if things don't go well, that your own credibility is at stake given where you stand on this?
Well, I would say that it'd be one thing if I was coming on here trying to be a coronavirus truther, trying to be someone who says there's nothing to worry about. I have said over and over again, people should not listen to me for health advice on any of this kind of stuff. I have made no opinions about what the best course of action to deal with this from a health standpoint is. But when people say that we still need to try to have a season because of how important it is for the people who play the sport, how important it is for the people who make their living around the sport, how important it is symbolically for our society overall, when they say they want to move forward with that, I say my only opinion is we need to give them a chance to we need to give them a chance to do that.
And I agree. I think what we saw yesterday was a lot of people who, when the news came out that the Miami players, I believe now, I think 11 total had tested positive for the coronavirus. That is clearly an outbreak. A lot of people are like, we'll just cancel the sport, shut down baseball.
Right.
And if that was going to be the case, and that was going to be Major League Baseball's plan of action, then there was no point at all in coming back, period,
Sure.
because that's just something to expect. And I can guarantee you something like this is going to happen to a college football team this fall. I think what we have to do, and I think the next big step here is to see, okay, what sort of ramifications come from this? I think what you saw in the MLS tournaments, there were teams that were just said, hey, because you guys can't get your coronavirus tested and positive casing under control, I believe Dallas and Chicago on the men's side and Orlando on the women's side, they said, you guys just can't play in this tournament because you guys are clearly at a health risk. I don't know if that's possible to do with these big money-making enterprises like the Miami Marlins, like a possible college football team. But I'll be really interested to see over the next couple of days the way things sort of go and shake out and sort of what that next step in the theoretical plan that Major League Baseball and hopefully other sports have for if and when, as we see now, these outbreaks happen.
Yeah, listen, let me do one more thing on this and then we'll move on. I think that there's a way to take this seriously without panicking over it, if that makes sense. There's a way to treat it as one of the most significant things that's happened in my lifetime without being melodramatic about it. And when you look at a few positive tests for the Miami Marlins and say, well, that means you just need to shut down the entire Major League Baseball and football shouldn't even try to take place, I would suggest that those people, even if they're well-intended, and the honest truth is I believe almost everyone is well-intended in terms of the way they speak about stuff, but even if you're well-intended, if you take one piece of data like that and turn it into a reason to shut everything down, I would suggest, even if your intentions were good, you veered in the direction of melodrama, and you're not helping at all here.
Right. I think the important thing to know here and to remember is that, I'll explain more of this later on, but let the health experts and the people in power sort of go forward with the plan that they theoretically already have in place. I choose to believe that MLB had a plan ready to go in place for when this happened. Now, should the Miami players have played on, or should the Marlins have played on Sunday, given that they knew 4 players had tested positive? Probably not, but I don't have a problem with Major League Baseball postponing games due to fears or worries about this. The Yankees and Phillies game, for example, tonight has already been postponed because the Phillies are just still waiting to get test results back, and I think that's A-okay and perfect way to go about doing things.
Yeah, I said I was going to be done. Let me say one more thing. I think it's important to note here. The Miami Marlins, and I'm not being funny, I'm being serious, they're the laughingstock joke of Major League Baseball. It's not a surprise here that Major League Baseball's attempt to return and get back on the field is hampered by its weakest link, and the Marlins are the weakest link franchise in Major League Baseball, which I think is also important to note for college football. One of the things I think you could say, if you want to have a little bit more even-handed look at things, the fact that the SEC, the other Power 5 leagues, are trying to move forward with college football without having to worry about their own weakest links, programs, conferences that just simply can't afford to test players, can't afford to take care of players at the same level that the SEC teams might be able to do. To me, the fact that the Marlins are tripping up all of Major League Baseball is the perfect example of why the SEC needs to move forward without worrying about the rest of the country, because, frankly, if you bring the rest of the country into the discussion, all of a sudden you are, in a weird way, almost liable for their errors. And that, I think the Major League Baseball example of that is the perfect piece of proof of that.
I even said this to you yesterday. It's a fundamentally different story if this outbreak happens to the New York Yankees, and obviously the Yankees have had 2 games impacted by this, but it's a fundamentally different story if it's the Yankees or the Dodgers this happens to than the Miami Marlins.
But I would also say, not to turn this into a baseball show, the likelihood of this happening for the Dodgers, the Yankees, franchises that are not total jokes, I think the fact that the Marlins have already been a joke prior to this meant that the way they would handle coronavirus had a very high likelihood of also being a joke.
I don't know if I'm willing to go that far.
Let me change the subject here. I talked off the top of the program. Listen, I don't think Phil Steele is like the Bible of college football, like some people might do. I just think it's kind of a fun thing to to think about before the season starts. I think it's a pretty good snapshot of common opinion. And the fact that the projections for LSU's offense a year ago, quarterbacks, running backs, wide receivers, offensive line, the fact that it's not wildly different than the projections for Georgia this year, to me, there's something kind of there. I don't think that the Georgia starting quarterback throws 60 touchdown passes. I don't. I don't know that anyone's going to throw 60 touchdown passes again in my lifetime. But there's something there to me that if LSU could do that without much in the way of prediction of that prior to the season, boy, the door is open for Georgia to make some sort of change as well.
Right. You look at the factors that sort of went into that. You had a quarterback, and granted, Burrow and Newman and even JT Daniels as well, to mention him in there. While they don't have it, Newman and Daniels don't have experience at Georgia, they do have a dozen plus starts at the Power 5 level. I think the experience that Joe Burrow got in his first year at LSU was a big reason he was able to make the leap that he made last season. You look at the way these two programs have recruited. Georgia has arguably, maybe not at the wide receiver position, but arguably done a better job of stockpiling talent than LSU has. And LSU had, and that was always the thing with that LSU offense. There's a lot of talent there. We just got to figure out a way to get the most out of it. So I do think the pieces are there. And I don't necessarily think you're even saying to expect Georgia's offense to look, 90% as good as LSU's did a season ago. But I think the thing with Georgia is, if it goes from what was I believe, especially in the month of November last year, a bad offense to just an average offense or even an above average offense, couple that with what we think we're going to get from this Georgia defense this year, that should be enough to put them among one of the 4 best and possibly one of the best teams in college football.
Yeah, I mean, and one thing you and I have talked about a lot over the course of the offseason is about LSU is my belief that the person that should get the most credit, really the overwhelming majority of the credit for why that success happened a year ago was Joe Brady, which to me puts a spotlight on Todd Monken here at Georgia. I would put Buster Faulkner in that conversation a bit. But when you see the projections for LSU in 2019 and see how much better across the board they got, Jamar Chase, Biletnikoff Award winner, Clyde Edwards-Helaire, 1,400 yards rushing, Joe Burrow from solid starter to Heisman Trophy winner. I mean, it's the same personnel year over year, but much different results. To me, that shows you what's possible when you have the right coach in place. Remains to be seen how much Todd Monken's going to be the right coach for Georgia. But the Brady experiment for LSU a year ago shows you that when it comes to offensive firepower, coaching matters.
And I will retort that I've long held the belief that quarterback play specifically matters. I believe Joe Burrow made that offense look as good as it did a season ago. And you can look at that Georgia game where Georgia a couple of times had Burrow dead to rights, and he was able to sort of get out of it, use his feet, and make a big play downfield, specifically that one where, Trayvon Walker and I believe Monty Rice had him for a sack in the backfield. He bounced off. At that moment, I knew, well, Georgia, A, was going to lose that game, and B, Joe Burrow just officially wrapped up the Heisman. So I think it's spinning that forward and what it means for UGA, while I certainly agree with most of what you have to say on Monken, ultimately I believe it comes down to, is Georgia's quarterback this year, Jamie Newman or JT Daniels, going to be good enough to make the necessary plays it needs to against those elite teams? Because the answer was a year ago, as good as a quarterback as Jake Fromm was, he just was not good enough to make those type of plays.
I don't want to get lost in the weeds on this, but let's say it's either Daniels or Newman. Wouldn't you agree, though, that they're almost certainly a better quarterback in a Todd Monken offense, given what I think I know about Monken, than they would be in a James Coley offense? That's where coaching matters to me, that same talent. I think Newman's got the requisite talent. I think that JT Daniels probably has the requisite talent. I'm pretty sure that he does. Same level of talent, but that talent is just better maximized by a better coach, which I assume Monken's going to be in comparison to Todd, in comparison to James Coley.
Well, yes, that's certainly a fair point. I would say we were saying a lot of very nice and positive things about James Coley a season ago, and I think we saw how that necessarily turned out. But
yeah, but I would say what I was saying about Coley a year ago is different. What I was saying is I thought that Coley was fine, and the way in which my opinion has kind of changed over the course of a year was you can go back and find a lot of examples from me a year ago saying, I'm not quite sure how much coaching really matters. If you've got the best players, I think you're going to be fine. I think Coley's probably fine. Last year was a year for me to really kind of come headfirst into a face-to-face with the idea that on the offensive side of the ball, getting the most out of the scheme. I saw what LSU was doing with Brady, what Georgia was not doing with Coley. I came to the opinion that coaching matters. I say on the show all the time, I change my mind slowly. My opinions alter very, very slowly. That doesn't mean they can't change. Last year, my opinion about how much coaching matters, at least on offense, really changed.
Well, one thing I'd be quick to mention here is, especially you look at, even great offensive coordinators, sometimes it does take time for these systems to take hold. Todd Monken's first 2 years at Southern Miss, did not go very well. They were a 5-win team combined those first 2 years. You look at Tampa Bay, he really didn't start getting a better offense until his last year there, ironically. And then you even look at the Browns last year in a 1-year stint. That offense, I think, pretty clearly took a step back. And just another anecdotal example here. You look at the Falcons with Kyle Shanahan. I know he's not necessarily a super popular guy, but that first year, that offense wasn't that great. And then that next year, it was just, I think because of the familiarity, it was a wildly different, more successful offense.
All right, I got other topics I want to hit, but yes or no before we move on. Is it fair to say that Georgia needs to adopt a no-excuses mindset? No spring practice, coronavirus impacts the start of the season, go out and win anyway.
Yeah,
no excuses.
Everyone's playing by the same rules
yeah,
here.
Yeah, I like that. All right, let me move on. You wrote something really good at DawgNation.com, but as we're kind of in this sort of like coaching observed walkthrough period leading up to the start of practices, the players that benefit the most from this right now, you mentioned guys like James Cook and Tyreek Stevenson, quarterbacks, obviously. Just give me kind of an idea of why you chose. You don't have to run through every single name, but kind of why you chose the players that you chose.
Yeah, I mean, the quarterbacks I think are the most obvious because they actually now get hands-on work on the field with Todd Monken in that offense, along with additional time for meetings. And I just think those reps will be incredibly valuable, even if they are not necessarily the high-pressure reps that you would maybe see on a college football Saturday. But quarterbacks aren't getting hit in practice anyway. So what they're doing right now might not, to me anyway, be all that different than what we see, later on in August when it is a full-go practice. I think with the other guys I was going with, specifically James Cook, Jermaine Johnson, and Tyreek Stevenson, those are guys who I think if they're going to be successful this season, it's going to be because of their versatility and how they are able to fill in and do multiple roles within these sort of offense and defensive schemes. So for Cook, it's going to be, okay, what is Monken sort of able to glean from him and learn from him in this period and sort of maximize his strengths as both a pass catcher and as a running back?
Yeah.
And on the defensive side, sort of Jermaine Johnson in the front seven and Tyreek Stevenson in the secondary, how is Dan Lanning, how are Kirby Smart able to move those guys around sort of like chessboard pieces and get the most out of them by having them do the most things? Because I think we'd say with Johnson and Stevenson, while they might not be the most talented players at their specific positions, I think because of their versatility, that's what's going to allow them to get on the field and make an impact for this Georgia defense.
I don't disagree with anything you said there. In the case of James Cook, the one thing I'll also point out is Kirby Smart's always kind of called that winter period of the year, January, February, March, as like the phase one of the college football calendar. That phase one portion of the calendar, I think, was also really important for James Cook because to be the best that he can be, there's a certain body type you have to have. He'll always be a little bit different kind of running back, but if you want to be a running back, you got to be pretty rocked up. I'm not saying that he wasn't before, but this is an important year for him to make sure that he was in the best physical condition he could be. And we saw some pictures of him going back to, and this was weird this year because of coronavirus lockdown, but working out with his brother Dalvin, stuff like that. Sometimes it's hard to tell from a picture, but the photos I saw of Cook made it look like he was in really pretty good shape.
Right, when he came, it was stunning to see when he first got to campus just how much smaller from like a weight and build perspective he was compared to some of the other running backs that we've seen suit up for Georgia. And I think, year one, year two, okay, he gets the body where he needs to be, but maybe he's not entirely comfortable playing at the weight he needs to be at. And again, he was not totally healthy that offseason before going into his sophomore year, but now, the health concerns aren't quite there where they used to be. He's probably more comfortable playing in a bigger body than he had when he first got to Georgia. And I think the big thing with Cook is just finding a role that he is comfortable in and a role that he can succeed in. Because last year, I think just about everyone agrees, Cook was not put in a role for him to succeed in.
I want to finish on the topic of recruiting for a moment. You said a moment ago that on the season this year, it's fair to say no excuses because everyone's dealing with the same challenges when it comes to the coronavirus. Recruiting kind of much the same way. On paper, it seems like Georgia's been more harmed by the lack of visits than other programs have, and yet everyone's having to deal with this kind of in the same way. I would argue, though, and I said this yesterday, that if you look at what I think of as like the four main ways that you can win with recruits, I think that Georgia sells family feel more so than it sells business decision because it hasn't had the NFL draft success that some programs have had. It certainly hasn't won national championships in the last couple of years. Georgia can no longer sell early playing time. I think if you're trying to recruit without the benefit of visits right now, being able to sell people on the idea of come here, we need you badly, we'll make you the starter right away, or come here because we've won a gazillion national championships, this is what players of your caliber choose to do. I think it's a little bit easier to recruit with those mindsets with the absence of visits. If you're Georgia and you're selling how cool of a place Athens is, how strong of a bond you'll have with your position coach, and for Georgia that has really mattered over the course of the last couple of cycles. This is not me making an excuse for what I think of as a pretty slow start to the 2021 recruiting cycle. I would just say that Georgia finds itself in a bit of a unique position in that, to my eyes, it is more harmed by not having visits than other programs are. Do you agree?
Yeah, and to sort of illuminate your point, you'd agree there's probably 5 elite college football recruiting powers on a yearly basis.
I think that's about right.
Georgia, Alabama, LSU, Clemson, Ohio State.
That'd be my list.
Those other 4 teams all have a national title in the past decade.
Yeah.
Georgia does not.
Right.
And again, Georgia winning a national title, I think, cures a lot. And what we've seen is just how crucial and how important visits are to sort of the UGA recruiting machine. And the fact that they don't have those, I think it shows why specifically some of these out-of-state, longer-range targets, guys like Dallas Turner, Tony Grimes, though Grimes is a very different recruitment given the way we've seen everything play out there in Virginia. When they're not able to get face-to-face and sort of make them feel comfortable at Georgia and have that luxury, it's going to be a little bit harder. I think one thing to keep in mind is I think this class specifically might end up looking like that 2017 Georgia class did, where you've got the big name, hyped in-state quarterback, you've got a couple big offensive line pieces, and you've got some solid contributors, but you don't necessarily have those high-end 5-star guys that you always saw in those 2018, 19, and 2020 classes.
Yeah, I mean, listen, we talk about recruiting on this show every single day. That's not going to change. However, as I mentioned on yesterday's show, my mindset, and I'm speaking as a fan here for a moment, right now I'm far more interested in, does Georgia use the 5 stars that it has more so than refilling the coppers with that next generation of 5 stars. If Georgia has a great year this year on the field, then Georgia recruiting is set up for the next few years. However, if this year doesn't quite pan out the way it's supposed to, I mean, I'm just going to be very honest. The elite recruiting is going to eventually run out anyway.
Right.
At a certain point in time, recruits are going to want to see the results with the guys they think look like them. And that's NFL draft stuff, and it's on-field team success. And college football is a cool sport in that the individual goals and the team goals are actually fairly well linked. The teams that have the most draft picks typically are the teams that do the best on the field. At a certain point, it's time for results to take place to keep the elite recruiting pipeline going. So for the next few months, I'm more interested in the guys already on the roster than I am about the guys who are about to come in.
To do my best Colin Cowherd impression, think of college football teams as restaurants.
Yeah.
You can go out, and Georgia, I believe, has done this, and get the world's best ingredients, and you can advertise that and say, we've got the best beef, we've got the best vegetables, we've got the best grill, we've got the best facilities, we've got all that. But at the end of the day, if your cooks aren't living up to the standard and getting the absolute most out of those best ingredients, eventually people are going to stop coming to your restaurant. And in that sense, you're not going to be, because people are going to stop coming to your restaurant, you're not going to be able to go out and get those best ingredients that you need to sort of make the food that you want. So with all that metaphor means is Georgia has to, I think, as you said, continue and start to get the absolute most of what's already on its current roster so it can sort of continue to have that pipeline of great players coming into it.
And I'll finish on a very positive note. I think that Smart clearly gets this. I think the actions of the offseason are an indication of that. Aggressively going out and getting Matt Luke, a guy that I think is going to be a great on-field coach for the offensive line. Going out and getting Todd Monken, well outside the box, what we would typically expect Kirby Smart to do. The Buster Faulkner hire, I think is huge. I would have been fine with Faulkner as an on-field coach. As an analyst, that's an embarrassment of riches in terms of the luxury that Georgia has. I think that Scott Cochran is, in a way, a step towards some of that as well because of just his ability as a master motivator. I think that Smart gets it's time to really put up on the field to keep the pipeline flowing.
Yeah, I think you and I would both agree on this. I think we can say Kirby Smart has realized that he had to make a change in the way he views and coaches on the offensive side of the ball. How that looks on Saturdays in the fall, hopefully that we have one, and I do believe we're going to try and have one. That's sort of the final hurdle there, because it's easy to say one thing but then end up doing another. So I think with Smart, if he's able to show that, hey, I'm able to take my hands off the reins on the offensive side of the ball and let these assistants that I went out and got do what they're paid to do and do it very well, I think that's going to bode very well for the future of the Georgia football program.
Good stuff, Connor. Appreciate it.
Yep.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
There you go. Connor's got a tough job. He's got to be the guest of the show. He's got to be the the producer of the show there as well, and the transition there is always a little bit of a challenge. I always enjoy our weekly conversations with Connor. We can bring there you go. I always enjoy our weekly conversations with Connor, though, because he's got really good insight. It's kind of fun to kick some stuff around. It's also kind of fun. The show would be boring if every single person that came on had the exact same opinion that I do. We don't really do the arguing show here. There are other places you can go to get arguing on the internet, but I think it's important from time to time to bring on some different perspectives, some different ideas on all that kind of stuff. By the way, let me tell you something that's really fun right now. The return of Major League Baseball. Not a great night for the Braves last night, we'll admit that. But, man, really fun to see the Braves take 2 of 3 in New York. The Austin Riley home run in the day, I still don't think that's landed yet. It's a sprint of a season this year, 60 games. Braves using a designated hitter. Braves, playing, kind of a must-win brand of baseball virtually every night. Max Fried, Mike Soroka at the top of the rotation. This is a great duo. This is a fun brand of Atlanta Braves baseball right now, and the best way to follow along with everything that's going on this year is go to Braves.com/schedule. It's a different kind of schedule. The Braves playing just the National League East foes, also the American League East as well. It's one of those things where you almost have to look at the schedule every day to kind of say, okay, where are they going? What's this going to be like? But it's been a great start to the year, and you can go to Braves.com/schedule to find out more about that as the Braves try to keep pace with what is a very deep National League East right now. Let me shift gears here, SEC through time, and I talked at the top of the program, or near the top of the program, that for the people who have been so emphatic in stating that there should not be a college football season, there ought to be a level of accountability for them if the season goes off and if it goes well. An example of that I think you just got to point out here is Paul Feinbaum. Paul Feinbaum has strangely been among the most melodramatic voices in all of media about the season not taking place. I'll go back and read you something that he said on ESPN not all that long ago. He says, the reality is the college football season is slipping away. This was in the month of July, by the way. The reality is the college football season is slipping away. They can hold on to hope, but if you look at the reality of what's going on in this country, it's dreadful news. Not only with the Ivy League, which canceled, but also the stories about Ohio State and North Carolina shutting down practice. It was the worst day college athletics has had since March when the whole world shut down, and I don't see it getting any better. That's Paul Feinbaum like a couple of weeks ago. This is not like in March. This was like early July in which he said this. And yet Feinbaum goes on the Birmingham radio station, WJOX, this week and says, to call the season off now, I don't think is really very brilliant because you don't know what the world looks like in 6 weeks. I think they all have to gamble that it gets better, and if it doesn't, they're going to have to deal with it. That's a very reasonable, measured response. That's almost exactly the way that I feel. You've got to try to have the season. If something goes wrong, then you have the freedom to shut it down later. You don't have to make the decision to shut it down now. What Feinbaum says there is totally reasonable and measured. But to say that a couple of weeks after going on ESPN and saying there's no chance of having a college football season, it's almost as if Feinbaum knew he was speaking to two different audiences. The Birmingham radio station, the national audience from a New York City studio. It's almost like he's telling different groups of people what he thinks they might want to hear. Either way, I think it's absolutely fair to call the credibility of Paul Feinbaum into question over something like this. I think Feinbaum's been awful during this entire process, melodramatic on the one end, a little more sensible on this end, but when that sensibility comes at the expense of total hypocrisy, I mean, what do you say about that? At a certain point in time, people like this have to know we remember the things that they've said, Feinbaum here included, who up until now I haven't had much of a problem with. I thought Cecil Hurt had a very interesting piece in the Tuscaloosa News. One way or another, if the season takes place, we know it's going to take place with almost certainly a greatly reduced number of fans, and there is big money at stake for these college programs if that indeed takes place. I'm talking about big money losses on the heels of all of this. I thought Hurt's column in looking at all the different ways in which Bryant-Denny Stadium could be filled and the amount of money that Alabama would lose because of that. I will also say in watching a lot of Major League Baseball, it's been a little weird for me, the absence of fans, maybe a little weirder than I thought it would be. But ultimately, the thing I have to keep reminding myself is, if this is the way forward, baseball with no fans, eventually college football with very few fans, then you just got to make the best of it. And I think that's the job of all of us right now, just to make the very best of this. But for the fans themselves, it's a very different kind of experience almost certainly coming. And for the universities, the athletic departments who depend on all of that revenue that comes in, football's a big TV sport. There's been a lot said about what ESPN stands to lose. In terms of, the money associated with college football, like $800 million worth of ad revenue already in the books. For college football, a big part of this is the attendance quotient there as well. One way or another, as Cecil Hurt points out in the Tuscaloosa News, this is a little bit different kind of season we're heading our way towards. We'll make that your SEC through. And let me shift my gears back to Georgia here for a moment. There's generally speaking kind of a hard and fast rule that you can pretty much always apply to a show like DawgNation Daily presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. In the battle between solid and spectacular, we are almost always going to talk about spectacular. Just makes for better podcasts, better streaming video, just more interesting. Probably also, my personality bent sort of is more interested in the spectacular as opposed to the solid. But if you look at what works in a football field, solid compared to spectacular, solid really gets the job done a lot. And since Kirby Smart has been Georgia coach over the last few years, in a lot of instances where we would have looked at two different players, one more spectacular, the athletic credentials, another guy a little bit more in the solid category, kind of flying under the radar. In many cases, it was the more solid player in comparison to the spectacular player that ended up getting the job done. Let me give you an example of that, maybe happening again this year there as well. And once again, I promise y'all, I'm not going to do this Phil Steele magazine forever. But there was something kind of interesting about the Phil Steele college football preview that I thought was kind of interesting. I looked at this yesterday, Phil's list of the draft eligible players, and if you look at the top 53 cornerbacks, DJ Daniels number 8 on this list. No real surprise there. Daniel had himself a very good year, I thought, a year ago. Eric Stokes, number 9 on this list. Also not a big surprise in terms of potentially draft-eligible players. But coming in number 14 was Mark Webb, ahead of Tyson Gamble, by the way, who's 16. Now, we have talked about Tyson Gamble, talking about over and over and over again on this show because he fits the bill of spectacular. And I do think that Campbell's a pretty spectacular athlete. I think he's setting himself up for a pretty amazing season. But Mark Webb, who on shows like this does not get as much discussion as maybe he should, is a lot more in that category of solid. But go back and look at Webb's season a year ago. A guy like Webb had a lot more tackles than people realized. And on shows like this, we're going to focus in on Tyreek Stevenson because Stevenson was an Uber recruit. We're going to focus in on Campbell because Campbell was an Uber recruit. But when you look at the overall, profile of how Georgia gets it done defensively, I have no idea where Mark Webb's going to get drafted at the end of this year. I'm not sure about that. But in terms of being an on-field contributor, being a guy who gets it done at that star position, a guy who can also help out with the run game when you really need that with limited run personnel on the field, I guess what I'm saying here is I think there's still a huge role left for Mark Webb to fill in this Georgia team. And the Webb story in of itself is pretty fascinating. Going back to a time in which he came into Georgia's 4-star receiver, ended up quickly moving to the defensive side of the ball, thought he had a chance to contribute there, and he's really been, once again, to use the same word again, this is not a backhanded compliment. It is a full-fledged compliment. He's been a solid contributor for Georgia ever since. This is a Philadelphia tough, guy that lays the lumber in that Georgia secondary. And there'll be players who are a little flashier and get more attention on shows like this. But that's not Webb's fault. That's my fault for sometimes not noticing the guys who are solidly getting it done. So good job by Phil Steele for putting Webb pretty high on his list. And by the way, if you look at the players outside of UGA that Webb is listed ahead of here, there's some pretty nice names on this list. I told you that Webb comes in at number 14. Go down this list here a little bit. You've got guys like Christian Tutt, who's 53rd on this list. I think of Tutt as a pretty good player. Elijah Blades is 40th from Texas A&M on this list. I think of him as a pretty good player. Marco Wilson's 38th on this list. I think of Wilson as a pretty good player. There's J.C. Horns at South Carolina. I think of him as a pretty good player. He's 34th on this list. And yet Mark Webb, 14th. That's a nice job by Phil Steele, recognizing the work that Webb's been doing in the Georgia uniform. It's a crowded secondary. Playing time is going to be hard to come by for everybody. As Connor mentioned, an expanded role for Tyreek Stevenson this year almost for sure. But let's not count out Mark Webb in that discussion here either. I thought that was kind of a nice thing. Speaking of nice things, Georgia put out a great video. We're all trying to do our part. We're all trying to take the coronavirus seriously, team together to get ready to be back on a football field this fall, or just keep our society healthy, get kids back in school, things like that. Kirby Smart voiced a video for Georgia on this. Wanted to give you a little taste of that audio. Here's Kirby Smart with a strong message for UGA fans.
We are the University of Georgia, and today we set the standard for all people everywhere of a better tomorrow, when we'll all be together once again.
Our mission unites us. Together, though apart, we build a greater, safer future for all.
I thought it was really well done by the UGA on the football Twitter account. I'm always going to be a sucker for like nice cinematic scored music with someone reading a voiceover over top of it. That always kind of works on me anyway. On this particular topic, it's a good one. It's nice to see Smart doing that, and I don't know, man. It just gets you really blood flowing, revved up, ready to go in the hopes of being back on the football field again here this fall. So we'll keep all trying to do our part and be ready to do all of that and continue to see sports progress, whether it be, the Major League Baseball stuff, the MLS, NBA coming back there as well. If we can keep folks out of Magic City, we'll just, keep trying to get back on a sporting event. And obviously, hopefully, all of this is a precursor to college football's eventual return there as well. Let me give you some good news also on the way out the door. Around here, we believe that a good Georgia fan's a Gator hater. It's always nice to know that it's now been 1,368 days since those lousy, stinking Gators have beaten the Georgia Bulldogs. That's our Gator Hater Updater here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. We'll see you tomorrow, everybody. And on video. Time now for our R.S. Andrews Cool Down. We will take your comments, and we appreciate you being a part of that. Of course, air conditioning, heating, plumbing, electric. You can trust R.S. Andrews to do all of that for you. They do all that for us around here, including the air conditioning stuff. If yours goes out, that's a bad situation to find yourself in. The best way to make sure that doesn't happen is to get it tuned up before it does. R.S. Andrews can get your system back to factory fresh specs. It just costs $99. Check them out online today, rsandrews.com. All right, yesterday it worked out pretty well for me to do the YouTube comments on the laptop and the I did the YouTube on the laptop and the Facebook on the phone. It worked out pretty well. I may try to do that again today so I can kind of both comment sections kind of going at the same time. I'll pull up YouTube here and we'll kind of get going there. I'll pull up Facebook after that, and we'll just have a good time. We'll let you talk about whatever you want to talk about from today's show. Always appreciate you being a part of it. Frank Patterson asked a good question. He says, how does the JT Daniels' arrival impact Gunnar Stockton's recruitment? I would say that the thing that impacts Stockton right now as much as anything is the relationship that Georgia seems to have with MJ Morris, another very impressive quarterback from the class of 2022. I won't presume to know Smart's feeling on this necessarily in terms of which quarterback he favors, but there's been a lot more chatter about Morris as of late. Morris, who could most recently have Carrollton, I believe there's some move in terms of his high school destination. But Stockton, who I would say has a pretty strong relationship with like a program like South Carolina, for instance, but I think it's still to be determined what Georgia's top 2022 quarterback priority is. For the top of the line, best of the best quarterbacks, the presence of a guy like Daniels doesn't change very much, I wouldn't say. I mean, look at DJ Uiagalelei going to Clemson, even though Trevor Lawrence was already there. So, from that standpoint, I don't think the presence of, a crowded quarterback room necessarily scares off the elite of the elite quarterback prospects. But I do think there's a very fair question to ask about who Georgia's top priority among 2022 signal callers really even is. G. Grace on the subject of Keely Ringo. He likes Keely Ringo. I'm not sure who the comparison is to there, but he likes him. Cody Taylor says, what's my thoughts on Devad Wilson? Yeah, I said this on Twitter last week. I've got good memories of Wilson in a UGA uniform. I think he's the perfect example of a player that was good in the opportunity that he had. I think that luck plays a huge role in what happens in football. And I do think that Wilson was the unfortunate recipient of some bad luck. If you go back and listen to the stuff that Smart said about Devad in spring of 2018, Kirby was very complimentary of him in a way that Kirby's not, universally across the board, just throwing around those compliments. And then Wilson got hurt. And we saw him play pretty well in the Sugar Bowl to end that season. I think there's a chance on a much less deep, I don't want to say less talented, but a little bit easier lineup to crack in 2018. I think there's a chance we could have seen a lot more of Devad Wilson in that year had he been healthy. And then who knows how that would have impacted him for 2019. But he had an injury come along at a time in which he was, I think, really on his way to getting on to playing time. And it just kind of sucks when that happens, but that's kind of what happened for him. And, the rest is kind of history. I got no ill will to him whatsoever. If he went to Florida tomorrow, I'd shake his hand and wish him well. That's just kind of the way I operate on stuff like that. I mean, obviously I'm a fan. I want to see Georgia win. I want to see, rivals lose. But ultimately, I got great respect for the players who play the sport. And I understand that they want to play. They want to be out there doing that. So, I got no grudge against Wilson no matter where he goes. I said yesterday that I feel a little bit differently about Cade Mays. If for some reason that one kind of sticks in my craw a little bit more than some of these other transfers might. But ultimately, I just think sometimes it just the cards just get stacked against you. And I think that in Wilson's case, the injury happening when it did, I think was an unfortunate setback. Silent Chaos says, which of the games a more possible upset, Tennessee or Kentucky against Georgia? I mentioned yesterday about Kentucky that the one thing that is worth knowing is this is an offensive line that people have got some respect for. I think if Joey Gatewood, honestly, at this point in time, I don't even know where the rules are and stuff like this. I think Gatewood is the potential starter for Kentucky if he's given eligibility. I think it's kind of an interesting look there. Stoops usually has a pretty good defense all the way around. I don't know that either one of them is necessarily a likely upset for UGA, but Kentucky's probably a team at least worth paying a little attention to. I don't think that Tennessee's nearly as good as some people think they're going to be this year. Antoine Middleton says Wilson to UF. I know he visited there. I guess I'm of the belief that he'll probably end up going somewhere else. But like I said, even if he did, I wouldn't be that worried about it. I'd be happy for him no matter what. Matt Talley on the subject of 2022 quarterback says it'll be like the Vandergrift Caleb Williams deal where between Morris and Stockton, whoever commits first. Could be the case. Dwayne Mark Killing says, if you're playing conference only, what's going to happen when the playoffs start? I mean, listen, the one thing I believe is that one way or another, they're going to figure out a way to have a college football playoff. It's the other bowls kind of farther down the trough that I'm still not quite so sure about, but one way or another, there will be a college football playoff. Now, the question you're going to have to ask is, and I think this is a fair question to ask for some of the other sports that are taking place, I'm of the belief that if Georgia's playing an 8-game conference schedule plus one non-conference game, then from Georgia's standpoint, that's a real schedule. The only games you've taken off are the games that Georgia was going to be a huge favorite in anyway. You haven't eliminated any games that matter. That's still a pretty good judge of who Georgia is. I think that as long as that's the case, it's fine. Where things could get potentially pretty frustrating, people could potentially get pretty irritated is if you're trying to judge teams on the basis of a conference-only schedule when the conferences themselves are so different. The Big 12 had 21 guys drafted across the entire league a year ago. Don't tell me going undefeated in the Big 12 is the same thing as having even a 7-1 record, potentially even a 6-2 record in the SEC. They're just not built the same way. And so that's where the playoff, I think, could get really, the talk around the playoff could get really frustrating for a lot of people. If you're trying to treat the leagues as essentially even to figure out who the 4 best teams are, we know that the leagues are just not even in any sense of the word. So I think there will be a playoff, and I think given how different the schedules look for various conferences, there could be a lot of argument about who gets in. Charles Kaiser asked about the virtual reality media days. So the SEC really hasn't announced anything specifically yet about how that's going to take place. Media days in normal years have already happened. They've canceled those for now, and I think the uncertainty about the season is one of the reasons why. They'll do something virtually eventually, but it's going to be way, way different this year. Let's see what else over here on Facebook. Bruce Eklund says we need to play Virginia. I guess so. I mean, I'd love to see the 10 games. Georgia's in kind of a weird spot on that, though, because they're the only SEC school that has 2 Power 5 non-conference opponents. Everyone else only has the 1. And, if the idea of the need to play Virginia is because the game's ahead of Alabama, honestly, I'd be fine with that, but I don't buy the logic that it's some sort of disadvantage for Georgia if it plays Alabama in its first game. I think it's very easy to spin the exact opposite narrative of it's a disadvantage for Alabama to see nothing from Georgia on film. How JT Daniels would be used, how Jamie Newman would be used, what the Georgia offense looks like overall. I mean, the idea that it's some huge disadvantage for Georgia if it's not playing a game before Alabama it could just as easily be said the other way. Ultimately, it's a no excuses season for me. You play 7 games before Alabama, just go out there and win them. You play 0 games before Alabama, go out there and beat the Tide. I mean, that's really where I kind of come down on that. See what else? Miriam Martin Corbin, good to see Miriam checking in today. Philip Jordan Wells says the playoffs will happen, and I believe that's probably true. I mean, I think you see this with a lot of sports, where essentially the only thing the NBA is worried about is the playoffs. Like, they've brought, I think it's 22 teams into the bubble. Most of those have no chance of being a part of anything. They're just there so they can at least say they gave the teams that had a chance of qualifying for that 8th seed a chance to be there. Major League Baseball is much the same way. They're playing just enough regular season to justify having a playoff. For the most part, these professional sports leagues, that's where that really big money comes from, is those playoff contracts, things like that. So I think you can expect college football to have a playoff. The postseasons themselves and across all of sports are going to be as normal as they possibly can be, because there's huge financial incentive for that to be the case. It's the regular seasons made the most different by all of this. I didn't know this. Matt Rukavina says that Santiago Diarn has been under the weather. I was not aware of that. If he's watching, Santiago is one of our longtime viewers. Santiago, my prayers to you. Very much prayers to you for that. I was not aware that Santiago had been dealing with some illness. I apologize. Mike Zambiasi says it will be an expanded playoff this year. I know that's been talked about, but a lot of things that end up getting talked about, once again, to use the NBA as an example, at one point in time they're talking about having the teams that didn't make the playoffs all go to Chicago and have their own tournament. That pretty much fizzled away pretty quickly. I think the playoff is kind of much the same thing, where they may talk about having an expanded playoff, an 8-team playoff, because of the loss of some regular season games, some important non-conference games. If I had to guess, eventually that's one of those things. It's almost too good to happen, Well, the idea that college football could very quickly figure out a way to play an 8-team playoff and give us even more college football, I don't trust the powers that be to get that done. Let's see what else. Alan Verbanchik on the subject of how Kirby Smart could have impacted the Nick Saban defenses. Yeah, I think that, when Kirby first came here, one of the knocks on him was, well, how do you know he can be a good head coach when he was basically only running Nick Saban's defense at Alabama? I think that it is fair to say that history has proven that Kirby Smart was pretty influential in those Alabama defenses, because for the most part, they haven't been as good defensively since he's left. I think that Jeremy Pruitt was a fine defensive coordinator, but the Tosh LaPoy era, thus far the Pete Golding era, certainly have not really reminded you a whole lot of the best of Kirby Smart there. Don Williams says it's time for the conversation to start if it's a shorter season. So, Don, I'll be very clear about this, and I would put myself in the category of pretty optimistic voices in terms of the college football season. I don't think there's any chance that Georgia plays 12 games in the regular season. I don't think there's any chance. That's just my opinion, and I'm saying that as someone who very much expects college football to be played this fall. I'll be surprised if Georgia's playing 12 games. So I don't really know what you do with that, but I guess maybe I should be more clear about my thoughts on that. I don't think Georgia-Virginia is going to take place. I think there's a very good chance that the Louisiana-Monroe, Middle Tennessee State game is not going to take place. I think it's been pretty clearly stated the SEC does not want to play expanded conference schedules the way that the ACC reportedly, according to Brett McMurphy, is considering doing. So I don't think you're going to see 12 games from Georgia. I think you'll see a season this fall, and I think it's going to closely resemble what we're used to seeing, but I don't believe it's going to be 12 games, and I don't think it's going to start on Labor Day. So I guess that's my thought on that. But I'm wrong all the time. Let's see what else. Randy Hall says you need to give this year's Georgia some sort of nickname, some sort of tagline. Yeah, I like the idea of that. I remember back in the late 80s, they tried to bring the Junkyard Dogs thing back again, and boy, it's tough to recreate that magic. Jacob Thompson says, this is on YouTube, people thought Kirby was running a Bama defense. Turns out Bama was running a Kirby defense. I don't think that's unfair to say. I think it's funny that Nature Gator, one of our Florida fans who watches the show, is arguing with Huck Finn. Like, Huck Finn is such a troll that even the non-Georgia fans are trolled by him. I think that's kind of funny. Let's see what else. Bamba Boy says Kirby's running the Belichick defense. Saban stole it. Yeah, listen, all these coaches take from each other for sure. Noah Sheldon, thank you for the kind words. I appreciate that. Interesting comment, by the way. Who was it that said this? I lost the comment I was going to read. Brandon Howell says Jalen Carter is the freshman I'm most excited about. Yeah, I would say there's reason for that. I do think it's a little weird that he's wearing 88. Like, this is like, I don't mind like receivers wearing whatever number they want. I've kind of gotten over the single digit stuff, but I don't know. Like, why is Jalen Carter wearing a tight end's number? That seems to me a little weird, but I guess you gotta just roll with those punches. Georgia's got a lot of that this year. Defensive linemen wearing the 70-something numbers. I guess a couple of those are potential offensive linemen too. So you gotta, keep that in mind. But there's a lot of non-traditional defensive line numbers for Georgia this season. Courtney Fisher says, "How do you feel about safety and tailgating?" I don't think there's gonna be much tailgating, and at least for a long time. I think that part of the issue with tailgating is, even though there's absolutely a socially distant way to tailgate, many of you will be tailgating in your own front yard if you're not going to the games, right? I mean, there's a socially distant way of spending some time around people, I would say. I just think that the issue here is the unspoken part of all of this in the return of sports is liability. And that's one of the reasons why you get nervous if you're Major League Baseball and you got Marlins players testing positive. College football teams have shut down voluntary workouts a lot. Liability is just a big, big issue. And if college football is going to work really, really hard to get back on a field, I don't think they're going to leave themselves vulnerable to the liability of having people tailgating on their campus. Because in a place like Georgia, most of the tailgating does take place on what is essentially university property. It's not all on university property. Some of it's city property, but some of it's private property. But a lot of it is on university property. And so therefore, they can police that. They can get you off the campus. No tailgating on the campus. They have the power to do that. And I think that as long as we're talking about reduced capacity in the stadium, we're talking about essentially zero tailgating. At least on what is university property. I would guess that, some of the municipal lots and things like that, the city of Athens would probably adopt essentially the same policy of, it's just going to be really weird. If you're going to a game, it may be like going to like a Braves game in the 80s. You just may be driving up 5 minutes before kickoff, walking straight to the stadium, seeing very few people on the streets. It could be a very weird experience. But I'm guessing as long as there is a limited capacity allowed in the building, then tailgating for the most part, at least in sanctioned areas, is going to be non-existent. Now, what do you do in like apartment complexes that are near the campus and things like that? That's where it could get very interesting. I'm not really quite sure. But in terms of the sanctioned, either university-owned, city-owned areas, that's kind of what I'm guessing. Mark Abe says he agrees liability is a huge factor. And this is one of the reasons why I'm always going to pivot back to, I have great respect for the people who are trying to get this done because they are volunteering for extra responsibility. There are so many people waiting to pounce on them the moment that anything goes wrong, even if what goes wrong isn't necessarily catastrophic. The fact that you would operate in a leadership role in the face of so much liability, both in terms of public perception, just outright legal responsibility, to me, it takes great courage to do that. It does not take all that much courage to say, none of this should be happening, shut it all down. It takes incredible courage in the face of that criticism to still move forward. And I got respect for the people who are doing that. Nature Gator says, would I go to a game with limited capacity? I would. I think that I would. I think that I would. When I find myself in a situation, and a couple of times over the last few months, I've sort of accidentally stumbled into an area in which, wow, this is more crowded than I'm used to seeing. The other day I was where was I? And I just looked around and like, all of a sudden there were like 5 or 6 people fairly close to me. That definitely kind of got my attention. I think more than anything, it's just the weirdness of it. I haven't been very close to very many people in several months. When you do stumble into a scenario where all of a sudden a few people are fairly close to you, it's kind of it's a little off-putting compared to what you would normally come to expect. But for me, if someone gave me 4 tickets to be at the Georgia-Alabama game, yes, I would be going. If someone gave me 4 tickets for any game, I would be going. I don't think that you necessarily should do that, and you certainly shouldn't do it because I say that I would. But given my circumstances, given my situation, you better believe I'd be in the car on the way to some college football if I had the tickets in my hand. Noah Sheldon says Rick Gilbert's the next Jimmy Graham. It very well could be. We got to get ready to go. We got 1,000 things going on today. Anything else? YouTube is pretty much just arguing. Let me get Ken Blankenship, weighing in. Good to see Ken in the comment section, by the way. Always nice to have him here with us. Alan Verbonchik says either have the full season or cancel the season. Yeah, that's not my idea on this, Alan. I understand where you're coming from, but if you give me 8 conference games plus a non-conference Power 5 foe, I'm fine with that. That's a fun season for me. Like I said, I have not enjoyed the fanless sports as much as maybe I thought that I would, but even that, I'm fine with it. I was up this morning, reading about baseball and who's hurt, and Boltnevich getting released, and like that's sports to me. It's not the same sports that we've kind of grown up with, what we expected to have, a year ago or something like that. But if it's 8+1, I'm fine with that, and anything more than that would be just gravy for me. So I understand the frustration about it being different, but I'm willing to tolerate the frustration of it being different. I really am. Daniel Aldridge, thanks for the kind words. Keith Folds on the subject of players being safe. Yeah, I mean, listen, I don't have any numbers to back that up, but I can understand why someone would say that. I think that the presence of a college football, and this is the one thing that no one really talked about, but the presence of a college football routine, the presence of an academic routine, I think leads to better health outcomes for, think about, was it like 15,000 people that play college football or something like that across the board? For the 10,000+ people who are playing college football, the presence of that athletic and academic routine also leads to better health outcomes over the course of the next few years than the absence of that would probably have. And you don't have to look very far to find evidence of unfortunately the opposite of what that absence of routine looks like for many young guys, we'll call them. Robert Barnes says Carter's number was 88 in high school. Well, I guess that's fine then. Ken Blankenship also mentioning that the private properties could still be hopping for the tailgates, and you're right about that, Ken. They're not going to be able to restrict that unless they just maintain the ordinance of no more than 10 people, something along those lines. That would give the ordinance the power to be restricted, but for the most part, actual tailgating on private property could probably still take place. I think you're probably right about that. So listen, a lot to do, a lot to talk about, fun to be able to do it with all of you. Thanks for being here as part of our R.S. Andrews Cool Down. I mentioned Boltnevich before. Let me remind you to check out AJC.com. You can get your Atlanta news now, including a very, very strange situation involving the Atlanta Braves. When the guy that you trusted to start your playoff finale a year ago essentially released after one start here this season, very different physical appearance for Boltnevich, completely lost velocity. If you follow the Braves, this is all really interesting stuff. You can read all about that at AJC.com. And you can kind of keep up with some of the other stuff that's going on around the city of Atlanta. A lot of politics, obviously. We don't talk about that on this show, but to stay up to date on what's happening in your world, including multiple Senate races, everything going on with the city of Atlanta, the governor, everything else, AJC.com will get you up to date on all of that. Keep with it. There at AJC.com. Thanks for being here on the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. Don't forget, if your water heater goes out, something like that, in many cases, R.S. Andrews can replace it for you the same day. But you've got to find them online at rsandrews.com. Thanks for being here. R.S. Andrews Cool Down, DawgNation Daily, presented by Engineered Solutions of Georgia. We will see you back here at 10 a.m. tomorrow. For more DawgNation videos, check out youtube.com/DawgNation.